I think this is the reunion tour conference because I've been here a few times before, definitely in 2021 when I kind of did an initial presentation of this concept. It was where Stuart Cheddar, who you guys will hear from tonight, heard that we had a carbon map, and there's been some really interesting things coming out of that that I will let him speak to, or you should go grab them if you're interested. But yeah, it's been a path. And so for some of you, this will be a little bit of a recap, at least the beginning of it, but hopefully the rest of it will be a useful demonstration of some progression. Um, so I was contemplating when I was doing you don't really, usually you're so busy, you kind of got your head down trying to make gains and progress that you don't do the retrospective. You don't really look back at how far it's been, like what's happened and where you've come from. And so I was thinking about when I was putting this presentation together, what was my initial motivation? Like before there, I even knew what carbon was really in soil and what was the thing that I was the most excited about. And it was when I stepped onto land that felt like it was alive. It felt like there was a buzz or a hum, and it was the soil was springy, and there seemed to be a lot of pollinators around, and that's where I was seeing when I was stepping onto land like that. I was like, well, what is that? What are these things? And a lot of the time when I was talking to producers about that, like Blake Holtman and Andrew Sawa and different producers across Alberta, and they'd say, well, we're doing this rotational grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing or holistic management. And we're kind of, we're emulating how cattle used to move on the landscape and or how bison did. But we are seeing like our organic matter go up. And so for them, it was about 3%. For Doug Ray, it was about 3%. And so all of these things were interesting. And and so we were just like, what is that? We were trying to find some sort of proxy or some way of describing this ecosystem dynamic that was happening. So I will not belabor this because I'm sure just about everybody in this room is sick to death of hearing a speaker come up here and talk about the 6 soil health principles or some variation of that. But that was those experiences, those people that were seeing the organic matter in their soil go up were basically doing the 6 soil health principles and some sort of integration. And and again, when you're trying to figure out what is a thing that could motivate other people to emulate that same experience, it comes down to a process where you have to pick a boundary. And after the discussion of fencing, we know how important it is to have a clear boundary of where things are. But when we're looking at something like what feels like living land, it's a whole ecosystem dynamic, and it is a web of interconnections that are constantly pulling against each other and pushing against each other. But when we put a box around it, we think that, oh, we're going to look at this thing inside. But then there's all of these other factors that are going to pull and impact it. And then if we pick this box, there's another one. And even if we put the box around the bullseye, there's still a lot of extraneous dynamics that we're not taking into account when we're looking at what's inside the box. But because organic matter had a pretty, it was a pretty consistent story, it was something we looked into. And looking at a 1% increase in organic matter, these are just really high level calculations. They are not things you can take to the bank. I learned that the hard way. I'll get into that. But it's about 20 tons of CO2 equivalent per 1% increase of organic matter. And that's a significant amount. And that's something that could potentially turn into something, turn into a motivation for people to adopt these practices. And so initially, when it was like really exciting, it's like, okay, these people are doing this grazing and they're getting all of this, they're getting all this carbon into their soil and we're just gonna do there's already a no-till carbon offset in Alberta. So we can do that. Let's just do that. And so we started the process of investigating it. And it's, the thing about no-till is it's pretty easy to standardize. You either till or you don't. And there's a way, there's really specific parameters that you don't have to worry about. You can say this is what no-till is and this is what no-till isn't, and it's clear. And then you can also do research on that and then come up with a number and like an average of what you expect people to be sequestering in their carbon and reducing their emissions. And so that becomes the number. And that was how the Prairie Carbon Balance Project was how they had come up with the no-till protocol in Alberta. When we were looking at something like adaptive multi-paddock grazing, they had been or pasture or anything related to cattle. There was in the mid like 2015, 14, they had been working for over 10 years to try and find some way to create a carbon credit or some sort of quantified, like some sort of dynamic that could reward producers for good management. And and so initially we thought, well, we'll just set up a trial and we'll do something like the Prairie Carbon Balance Project. And then we went to actually set up a trial. And so I started calling producers and I was like, how big are your paddocks normally? How many head do you run? How often do you move? And the only consistent answer I got was it depends. And there was absolutely no consistency. Everybody had a different way, and it just made the scientists' head explode because there's no way you can call it a practice if there's no data that is standardized. And so it just became it was just convoluted. So and it also, even when you have a plan, it still changes. And so that is the very adaptive multi-paddock grazing, is that, if it rains or it doesn't rain, you're going to have a different grazing plan. And that's why the collars are so exciting, because you can do those adaptations on the fly. So I had producers saying to me, just measure the carbon and that'll work. Like, that's all we need to do. And then the scientists were saying it's too expensive, it's too complicated, and you don't even want to go there because it's soil so variable and you don't know you don't know how accurate your measurements are, and if you don't do it perfectly, and it's hard to replicate because somebody will look at a mid-slope position and somebody else will look at a mid-slope position and they'll have different opinions about what a mid-slope position is. So I didn't know where we were going to go from here. But in 2017, I managed to get an invitation to the UNFAO conference in Rome on organic carbon. And it's a conference like any conference, but they did have a very nice view of the Colosseum from the roof. So that was pretty exciting. But the more exciting thing for me was I met Alex McBrantney from the University of Sydney, and he is what they call the father of digital soil mapping. And we were standing in a call or in a group meeting, and he said, well, I have a patented method for farm scale carbon auditing. And I was just like, what? This exists? This is really fun. I have a lot of producers that are very, very excited about this. And so we took the next step. So this is just kind of the schema of how predictive soil mapping works, or digital soil mapping. This is adapted from Tom Hengel's work in a book called Predictive Soil Mapping. And his wife was one of Alex McBrantney's former grad students. And it was actually her PhD thesis that formed the basis of the Australian system for carbon measurement. And so basically what happens is you take the data, that like all the available data that you have. So anything that is baseline soil surveys that have been done, And then there's several layers of like satellite mapping, NDVI, and they all get kind of computed together to create a pre-prediction of soil carbon. And then the computer calculates the areas where there's the least certainty. And then that's where we go take soil samples and process them. And then we go out and take the samples. And then these two pieces come together. And then there's a lot of cross validation. And this is well beyond my pay grade. There are lovely people with PhDs that do this. And then you actually get the uncertainty, the prediction of the carbon stock with uncertainty. And so when we had figured out that this was a possibility, we started working with Tom Hengel in the Netherlands, and he said, you know what, it's actually better if we start with a broader area, and we'll start with the whole province, and then we'll kind of zoom in from there. But that'll give us a good representation. And so we started with 23 farms. A lot of them were partnered. They were long-term adaptive multi-paddock grazing sites that had cropland around them and had the potential threat of conversion. And then 2020, we went and did a fair amount of soil sampling. And then by 2021, we had an Alberta carbon map. And so this was the 2020 carbon map. And I guess the thing I just want to draw your attention to is that it is not a consistent amount of carbon across even Alberta. So that'll come into play later. And as we're starting this process of doing that, there was another group that was working on an avoided conversion of grassland protocol. And because it had been seen as, that's, if we can stop the bleed of the release of carbon, that's a major step in not just guaranteeing the survival and the health of the grasslands, but also in reducing a significant amount of emissions. And so this was the mechanism that they used for how to really demonstrate that there was certain things that needed, that was a way they decided to do it. They picked their box on the web, so to speak. So for additionality, you need to prove that the grassland actually is under threat of conversion. And you have to pass this financial test. And the way that they did it was based on a methodology from the US. And so it was based on an appraisal with the assumption that cropland is worth more than grassland. But in Alberta, which I cannot speak for Manitoba or Saskatchewan, but in Alberta, we have really beautiful views of the mountains that people will pay for. And they will pay just as much for that as they will for cropland. And also in the Southeast region, there's actually a preference for people that are going to pay to put on irrigation, that they would rather buy something that's been pasture and put irrigation on it than something that's been farmed as dryland cropland. So that really didn't give you, it wasn't really very effective. Also, there was a national average, which was just 1 ton per hectare. And when you look back at the Alberta carbon map, there is not just 1 ton per hectare, even in one province, let alone across the whole country. So it was very much like everybody just got the same. You paid, everybody got the 1 ton per hectare, and it was just an average, and that's how we were going to go. And then also because of a concept of leakage, like if you protect one grassland, there's a possibility that somewhere else something will be converted. So just because you protected something else is going to get converted. And so they had a number of a 20% discount. So if any of your 1 ton per hectare, you took a 20% haircut to satisfy that leakage. And then the other major issue was that the protocol only applied to land that was classed 1 through 3. And there we have, in satellite imagery we've been doing, there's definitely class 4 and 5 land, and possibly even lower, that are being converted to cropland at this point. And so it wasn't actually stemming the 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 conversion, because 4 and 5 were not eligible. Um, and then it also required a conservation easement as the only mechanism for permanence. And the conservation easements they're very useful. They have a place, but there are as many producers that are not particularly excited about putting them on their land, and they're quite expensive to establish. There was really still a lot of confusion around the eco gift program, and if you could stack that with carbon credits in 2019 when this was always coming out. And then we were also seeing that the economic value is concentrated in the first generation. I talked to numerous producers that said, Dad had to put the easement on because he needed the money, but now I'm stuck with the easement and that money is no longer available to us. And it's just kind of frustrating because we're left with this easement that we don't have control over. And and then and then if there is a reversal, like say 2 or 3 generations down the way, somebody just says, you know what, grandpa did this and I'm not interested in doing it anymore, and I just have this easement. There, if they do the conversion, there's absolutely nothing like there you can the land, the conservation organization or the it could can sue you, but there isn't that, like, if that conversion's happening from a carbon perspective, that carbon's already gone. So you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And so it's just relies on good faith. And I think a lot of people operate on good faith, but it still isn't, it doesn't build motivation going forward. But the biggest issue with the entire process was that so little of the land actually met all the criteria. So of 500,000 acres that were assessed, under 5% actually were even eligible to go down the road of putting an easement and trying to get the 1 ton per hectare per year. So a couple years later, my organization partnered with Alberta Conservation Association to launch the Regenerative Alberta Living Lab. It's funded through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and we are part of a network of 14 living labs, including one in Manitoba. And it's an idea of user-centered innovation and real-world context. And so we, having had the experience doing the mapping, we thought this is a great opportunity to collect more data and to make the mapping more effective, and also just understand better what are the practices and dynamics that are driving carbon sequestration, and figure out other things that we could do potentially with that data. And so we have 111 producers from the North Peace all the way down to pretty much the border, Many Berries and Waterton. And we're sampling on over 340,000 acres. We're taking meter deep cores, and they're divided into 4 depths. So we have that ability. And we are sampling, we're looking at both total carbon and total organic carbon, bulk density, aggregate stability, and water holding capacity, and then microbial diversity, as well as some nutrients. I did not put the whole list in, but the thing that has really been the driving force of the Regenerative Alberta Living Lab is not trying to find specific data on individual practices, but allowing producers to implement as many of those soil health principles as they're interested in, and to allow that innovation to move forward, and that we're not trying to contain it by having a prescribed notion of what a BMP is, and that the soil mapping gives us that opportunity to just capture what producers are doing, and then we're able to see how things are moving from there. Just Just gonna have a sip of water. So as we were doing the initial intake sessions for the living lab, we did one of the things that really came up was that producers said, we don't, this idea of adaptive multi-paddock grazing or rotational grazing, it's so hard to define. What we really want is data on how like our actual grazing is impacting our soil carbon sequestration. And we want to know how we're doing, not just what this practice is averaged out. And so we ended up building a grazing app that has both a desktop and a mobile version. And again, um, and then we set about doing this massive amount of soil sampling, and we've started to find some really interesting things. So one of the first things was that the carbon maps didn't always look the way we thought they would. Some of those producers that had increased their carbon by 3%, they weren't showing compared to their cropping neighbors more carbon than their cropping neighbors, which seemed wrong and almost offensive at a point. But what we what we weren't as aware of then as we are now is that as soil gets healthier, the bulk density drops. And so that springy soil that I was so excited about at the beginning, that's actually your bulk density dropping. So these two soils, this is the first one is this one, and the second one is this one. And so you've got an 8.6% organic matter, but a 1.4% or 1.4 bulk density grams per cubed centimeters. So you have, that's that guy. And the other one, you've got 12% organic matter, but only 0.73 bulk density. And so when you take, this is the functional in the soil probe, you know, you've just got a lot more airspace. And when you take it and actually grind it, you only have that much soil to that much air. Whereas this has just a lot less air. And so you're not going to store as much, you can't store carbon in air, really. So you're just not going to get, using carbon stocks as the only mechanism and the only way that we reward the pathway for soil health, like these increase of practices and that aliveness is not a sufficient mechanism to do that. But what we do have when we have all that airspace is we also have a lot more space for water to enter. And if we have water, if we have soil that's contained within these aggregates, and those are water stable, they've been weather stripped by polysaccharides or glomalin from mycorrhizal fungi, they will actually, when the water comes in, stay intact, and they will just be these little pebbles, and there'll be lots of room for water to come in. But when we don't have that water stripping, oops, sorry, we get the explosion. Oh, I don't know what's going on here. Okay. We get the explosion of okay. Oh. Okay, can I go forward? No, now I need to still go back. Okay. Oh, okay. If you don't see this for more than a second, remember the slide. Um, this is the one I want. Yeah. So those, you know, when you have a high level of water stable aggregates, you have clear water. I did not push it. That was not me. There is a ghost in the machine. Okay. And when you have, like I said, so when you have 20%, you get the mud and you get that aggregate stability that, or those aggregates that explode, but they clog the pore space. So you don't have that place for water to infiltrate. And so there's you need more than just the carbon stock and the bulk density. You also need a soil aggregate stability to understand how that soil is going to function. We also have been doing work with um, this is specifically, we did some work on carbon fractions. And so this is the aromatic carbons, which are down at the bottom. I'm so scared to touch the thing right now because I'm scared it's just going to jump. So the aromatic carbons are most correlated to the adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So we looked at some cropland. We looked at just kind of a much less intensively managed rotational grazing. And we looked at adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and we saw that there was an increase of those aromatic carbons that can be traced right from CO2 all the way to below 60 centimeters in the soil. And so that was really exciting to see that there was definite correlation between that practice and that work and actual ecological outcomes. And then we've also been working, doing genomics, looking at the DNA of all the microbes of the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. And again, in a more intensively managed pasture system, like an adaptive multi-paddock system, we were seeing that there was a higher fungal diversity at below 60 centimeters because we think there's more carbon being allocated below that rate through the interaction with the grazing. So, and then we're also seeing really exciting things. Like, it's just really electric. I am not touching it. Yeah, I'm not touching it at all. No, no, something's happening. Okay, so this one again, if it goes away, there you go. That was on a very regeneratively managed cropping system, but they were integrating where the purple field was. Let me see if I can get it back. Where the purple field was was where they were integrating a hay crop, perennials into the 3-year inter-potato year. This was another one of the producers that were adaptive multi-paddock grazing. It's just like hilarious. Maybe I do. I do. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. Okay. So this was another producer that's doing adaptive multi-paddock grazing. This is in the gray wooded soil zone in Alberta. So those luvisols were typically the most of the carbon was in the trees, not in the soil, compared to like a grassland system. And so, can you go back for 1 sec? So you can see where the trees still are, and then and oh. It's just like, it's it's interesting. So anyway, the point of this is that they were increasing the carbon in their soil through the adaptive multi-paddock grazing. They had a hay field, which is the other piece that was not increasing the carbon levels at the same amount. So it wasn't just perennials, it was actually impacted by their grazing. Okay, now we can go. So there's been some really interesting outcomes of that, and then for the last couple days we've been here with the Lincoln Center and the Babbitt Center and the Center for Land Conservation, and there's been a lot of discussion about what producers want to see in terms of grasslands conservation. And one of the comments that stuck with me the most was producers are very good at figuring out if you give them a goal and they can figure out how to get there. But if you're prescriptive and you only give them tools, it gets frustrating. And so we got some funding at the same, like as we were starting Living Labs, to look at a pilot for an ecosystem services registry. And we weren't really sure what that meant, but right as we got that information that we were gonna try and build a pilot, the Vera this Guardian article came out, and it was kind of catastrophic for the voluntary carbon markets. It was the largest verifier of carbon market or carbon credits in the world, had a significant number of their forestry credits that were deemed non non-viable. And so basically people had paid money for these carbon credits and they didn't really exist. So they didn't demonstrate that there was enough risk of conversion of forestry logging that it was they were really viable. And so like Shell and Disney and Gucci all bought credits and they were just kind of like out of luck. And it also took the carbon market, this is the only thing I'm going to say, Joe, took the carbon market like from sitting, credits were going $10, $15, maybe if you were lucky, on the voluntary market to down to $2. And so we had a very good platform that we had nowhere to go but up, but we had some really specific, like as I was talking about the Climate Action Reserve protocol, that there were issues with it, and we knew we needed to have come up with some different solutions, and then we also really needed to find a different way to continue to validate the credits going forward. Okay. So we started looking at these, what's under BMP. Weston really wanted to drive the adoption of best management practices. And so we were looking at BMP areas and non-BMP areas, and we're starting to see some good quantification that there was more carbon in the BMP area. Next slide. But that was not the whole story. Like being able to just measure the carbon is only part of what we really needed to do. And what Weston let us do was bring together legal experts, protocol developers, verifiers, blockchain specialists, because there was at a certain point, like, why wouldn't we put this in a very secure place where we wouldn't be able, people couldn't tamper with the data, there'd be a mechanism for double counting, and then to bring in the soil scientists and the biologists too. So next slide. So the number one focus was on validating outcomes, not practices. And that is a hard thing for protocol, like policy and definitely carbon to date. It's changed a lot, but this was in 2022. In the last couple of years, we're starting to see many more measurement-based protocols coming onto the market. But a lot of them are looking at, we're going to measure and then we're going to remeasure, and then that will be the delta, and that will be all we need to understand. But in this process of looking at measuring soil carbon for over now 5 years, we are seeing major variability inter-year in the carbon. And so that idea that you just measure and you remeasure and it just magically is going to go up it's not the best business model, I don't think, for carbon. And so it was more, how do you find a way to really have something that it already is, as opposed to something that might be. We wanted the credits to be highly auditable, and we also really wanted maximum efficiency, because that was the whole reason we started measuring. We were using the predictive mapping in the first place, was that we didn't want all the money to go to transaction costs and measurement costs and monitoring costs. If it was going to do, again, this was not about a scheme to just make money. It was a desire to see more people have more living land, and to be able to lean into that, and at least a little carrot that might get them there. Michael has all sorts of probably better motivations for doing this than some carbon credits or some ecological systems credits. But my hope was also that these things, that the carbon mapping would also give people another feedback loop on their management, and to be able to understand where their soil was changing and where it wasn't. So next slide. So as I mentioned, we moved on to a blockchain platform that has different nodes, and it's allows for the data capture to be independent from the verifier. And then when that is complete, then the verifier receives all the information and can go through the process. In relation to the maximum efficiencies, we have, through the grazing app, we've been able to have a geo-referenced photo option too, which helps decrease the amount of time and money that's spent from the verifier to go out and take pictures and make sure that grassland is grassland or that a practice is really happening. And then what it also allows, I feel like I lose the entire world. Stuart has witnessed this in some of the calls where we get into the details of the blockchain. So I will not get into tokenization and all of those things. But what it does is it allows for the articulation or the tokenization of the ecological service credit that might be able to go up as an independent dynamic. And then it also can be something that can be settled for cash and become like an actual financial payment. So next slide. So we had to kind of come up with a new solution for all of the issues that we saw in the CAR protocol. And so one of the things was how you find that equivalency instead of that 1 ton per acre per year. What do we actually, if we can find cropland within a 25-kilometer radius of the grassland that we're wanting to protect, how do we make sure it's comparable? And so the functional equivalence, instead of looking at classes of land, we just looked at the pieces that are actually comparable. So texture and landform need to be consistent. So we match the soil properties. And then we also eliminated slope that's over 20% and wetlands, because wetlands should be protected probably through a separate process, because that's a different thing than the avoided conversion of cropland or the avoided conversion of grassland. And then we just basically calculate that carbon difference. Next slide. So this is one of the sites that we are working on in Southeast Alberta. And what was really interesting is they had been buying cropland and actually restoring it over several years. And so they actually have all of this land that you can see. But our cropland equivalent was there. And so when we did that equivalency, we saw that some of this land that has been restored still hasn't caught up carbon-wise to the cropland. And so it's a within protocol development, there's always this focus on being very conservative. And so this, we know that there's more carbon in that grassland than there is in that cropland, but this stuff will need to wait for some years before it actually becomes eligible to be in an avoided conversion concept through this mechanism. And so it's not the perfect solution for every land. There is definitely land, as I mentioned, that is, because the bulk densities drop so low, we can't get the carbon map to look the way we expect it to. And I think that, going back to that web initially, the organic matter and carbon is just one box, and there is a whole web. Oh, next slide. Sorry. And so also through that process, we had to look at a different way to do the legal test is easy. That's just pulling title. But the financial test, because we couldn't rely on the land value assessment, we had to find different mechanisms. And so we have both rental rates, like average rental rates in the county, and also crop insurance averages per risk area of cropland being higher than grassland is also the demonstration that there is an economic incentive to convert to cropland. And then the other piece is just making sure that there is a grazing plan in place. And so the development of the app is a way for producers, they can submit a paper map if they are a plan, but there's also a digital mechanism that makes it that much easier to submit their grazing plan. Next slide. So the blockchain is also another piece that allows us to, so that the plan is that basically the buyers will have access to a node on the blockchain. I'm really trying to not use the jargon, but it's so hard because the blockchain people are the jargoniest jargoners in the world. I say that with all the love in my heart. But that the buyer will have an annual they will have a login, and they will get, so every year there'll be another mapping, there'll be the same photographic evidence that will be submitted. And so that person will be able to say, oh, yes, I see the carbon is still there, and I see the grassland is still there. And here's a picture from this year, and there's the grazing plan. And so instead of for those buyers who have been particularly just out carbon credits, it gives them some extra assurance that that is still a thing. And then we're looking at permanence in terms of where we would sell the carbon credits, all like the whole total amount quantified in advance or at the beginning, and then they would be invested into a fund, and that endowment, the annual investment income on the fund would be the payment that the producer would receive on an annual basis. The nice thing about this is there is no limit to the time that that payment would occur. And so it could be something that could get passed down along with the land, that payment is there. And it also allows for the buyers to have that assurance that that principal invested, if there ever was a reversal, that money can be either used to do replacement credits, or at the very worst case scenario, they can get their money back. And so it's a unique approach, I think, in that it gives that generational motivation, so that basically you don't have an easement, you can leave at any point, but you surrender that annual payment, and then the actual amount in the fund belongs to the farm. And if there comes a point where climate change is no longer a thing, and we don't need any assurance of permanence going forward, there is an opportunity that fund can get wrapped out, and that amount would get paid out to the farm eventually. It is definitely not the reason that you would do it, but it is an asset of the farm. Next slide. And then when it came to leakage, that was like a different process, and it was a really hard thing. And we've just gotten a bit more funding to be able to expand this process out. But what we're going to end up building, because with the leakage, we needed another mechanism to determine if leakage was happening. So we're building a prairie-wide basically tillage or conversion of grasslands monitoring system. And then that will track a prairie average on the amount of conversion. And then there'll be a local area of monitoring. And so if the conversion at the local area outpaces the provincial or the prairie-wide average, we'll do an investigation to see if the protection of that grassland had any impact on that conversion rate. If the things we were playing out was like, if there's BSC, or if there's some other mechanism that would just devastate the cattle industry, no one's going to get punished for having to make different choices. There's just going to need to be some mechanisms to be able to capture that and really understand what's driving. It's not the protection of some grasslands that's driving the conversion of others. Next slide. So for our next step, we are, through this extra funding that we've received, we're now looking at bringing in international buyers. We're looking at how to potentially mobilize a green bonds so that there is a mechanism for it to get these payments actually flowing out to producers for grasslands. We're also, because of all the reasons I've already described, we're also looking at other ways to quantify the outcomes related to grassland preservation, both water. We'll be working with MFGA and the Aquanti model on the modeling of water and how to develop water credits, drought and flood mitigation credits, and also biodiversity credits. Using Alberta Conservation Association's initial, they have 800,000 acres of biodiversity monitoring that can translate into biodiversity credits. And then our hope is that we will actually be able to build the system out for the entire prairies. So next slide. So if anybody is interested in learning more, the QR code, you can definitely put in your name and number, and we will let you know when we are looking at coming into Manitoba. So that is all that I have.
Can we just jump into questions?
Sure,
Okay.
I think so.
Tom Kravitz from Athabasca, Alberta. Kim, I'm wondering, I'm not aware of any buyers that are actually paying for carbon credits. And what I'm hearing from you, that is the case in Canada right now. How far are we away from that?
I think there is still a significant number of carbon credits that are trading. What we're seeing right now on the especially the Alberta compliance market, which might be, are you talking about voluntary market credits or compliance? Well, there still is there. We're still seeing transactions happening internationally on carbon credits. People are buying stoves in deforestation credits and stoves and like in developing nations, and there is still a demand for voluntary market credits, but we think that a lot of the reason that there's been issue with it is because there's been less assurance and less ability to have a mechanism that assures that they're actually real credits. So that is a process, but we're also part of an open geospatial carbon registry in Europe, and they are mandating reductions, and they're looking at ways to integrate carbon farming with every company that operates in the European Union. So there is mechanisms to still move that forward. So is that?
Test 1, 2. Hi, Kim. Thank you. First of all, my comment is, can I quote you on the jargoners? Yeah, okay. Just wanted to make sure I can add that to my vocabulary. My question revolves around the leakage piece. My personal interest lies in that social aspect of what happens when we try to conserve something in some place. Does it affect human behavior in some other way? So I want to ask the question about whether I understand this leakage issue or not. Is it sort of measuring the human response to humans sort of having a tantrum that they can't, do something to grasslands over in Alberta? And so they sort of say, well, oh yeah, watch me. I'm going to go to Saskatchewan or Manitoba where the grasslands are much more affordable, and I'm just going to till it all up, or I'm just going to do, is that a correct sort of, I know it's maybe layman's terms.
Well, I think how it's imagined, especially with the local, is that the local leakage areas that you would have, a farm that is trying to expand their cropland. And so they're going to buy, a piece of grassland comes up and it just gets converted immediately. And so if they can't get this neighbor's here, then they're going to move to this neighbor here.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to account for.
Yeah.
In terms of, technically with leakage, we should be looking at it on a global scale. And that's, it's kind of an impossibility. And so rather than just haircutting a 20% amount of credits like right off that, which really makes zero impact on whether anything's being preserved or not. What the goal is just to be able to monitor that local area and see, check for trends and then see what's really going on if there is a lot of conversion happening still.
So now that I understand that a little bit better, my question revolves around what other things should we be privy to in terms of leakage? Not just this, is there something else in your line of work or where you're rubbing shoulders with other people where this concept of leakage and sort of, filtering into other areas instead? Do you notice anything else? That's what I'm really curious about. Okay.
I'm not 100, I don't have a clear answer for you on that, but I will think about it. And if something comes up over the next couple days, I'll let you know. Awesome. Okay. Oh. One more.
I'm just curious if you have worked or partnered with any of the other organizations that are offering some kind of verification service like EOV through holistic management. Like, is there ways to overlap those programs that are happening as well?
We're working with verifiers of carbon credits, and so it's there is potential for looking at EOV. What we've because we would like to be, because we're quantifying all the way down to a meter depth and that bulk density measure, it becomes hard to work with sometimes other monitoring dynamics. But I think, potential, like as I mentioned with ACA, I think with the biodiversity measures, there's a great opportunity. And the goal is to have the fully stacked credit system and then also look further for other places of reductions. So.
Oh, okay, thank you. I come from a place where I know very little about what you're talking about. And what the impression so there's two things. First of all, the impression I'm left with is that the system you're trying to put into place is incredibly complicated and very difficult to do. And you're really struggling to find a way to do this, do what you're talking about, create this market for these credits, and that whole and all of the process involved in that. Is that the right impression I should be left with?
I think it's been a winding road of 10 years. And I think that the reason that there isn't a lot of we're struggling, native grasslands is more endangered than the Amazon rainforest. We've lost over 32,000 square kilometers of grasslands since 2008. And so there are mechanisms in place that are trying to conserve grasslands, but we're just trying to address the multitude of issues that have come up, but we are continuously evolving toward those.
Yeah, but what I was talking about is the one way in which you're trying to do it is to create these carbon credits that somebody somewhere is going to buy, right? That's really at the heart of all of this. And is it the case that that can only work if somebody somewhere, like you mentioned earlier, the European Union, requires companies to reduce their carbon output? And one of the ways in which they do that, just one of the ways, would be to buy these carbon credits that you're trying to create. Is that, in simple terms, what you're talking about?
Yes.
So not only is the whole process of getting producers or people who manage or own grasslands to be part of what you're talking about and how to verify that and so on, and make sure that the credits are real in the sense that the carbon that the credits are supposed to represent is actually in the ground or left in the ground. So your system is not only dependent on figuring all that out, and by the way, I might sound skeptical. I'm not skeptical of what you're trying to do. I'm just wondering about how possible it is. Anyway, so there's that, okay? And that in of itself is enough of a challenge. But then, if you can make all that work, that whole process work, and you showed some diagrams, like for example, that chain block and so on, you, at the end of the day, somebody somewhere, and I guess that's a government, has to mandate companies to reduce their, as I said earlier, their carbon emissions. And one of the ways they do that is by buying these credits. So even if you got it all figured out, you're still dependent on a government somewhere, like governments in the European Union, mandating what I just mentioned. Is that right?
This, like, there is still movement, despite the dynamics in the US currently, toward companies moving towards a net zero target. And so a lot of them, like all the pathways to net zero by 2050 that the global governments there's a lot of organizations that have made pledges. Whether they keep them or not is a question. Like this definitely, you're not wrong in any shape that this is a lot of. This seemed like it was something that was easy. It was relatively going to be achievable 10 years ago, and here we are still trucking away. But we are making progress. And so it's a question of, Canada's talking about trying to be an energy superpower, but continue to keep its climate commitments in place. And I don't see a way that we're going to be able to do that without starting to mobilize the nature-based solutions to help with that in concert, if we're going to still do considerable amounts of oil and gas and exploration. Okay.
We'll let you have the last question, David.
Okay, thank you very much. I've been working the last number of years on a thesis called In Search of Net Positive Carbon Grain Farming. So it's not exactly what you're talking about, but it's certainly a component of some of the obligations that we've made worldwide. Nestle's, I think about 2.5 or 3 years ago, made an announcement as part of the SBTI group, Scientific Based Targeted Initiative, that they were going to make a net zero pledge, which they've done. But they also, so they went down the rabbit hole. Their shareholders, their customers had suggested that in order to operate, they needed to go down that rabbit hole. But they also found out that carbon credits were not going to do it. They were actually going to have to make carbon cuts along their scope 1, 2, and 3 chains. So I essentially thought that carbon credits were pretty much dead because, if SBTI companies aren't going to do it, of which there's over 11,000, then who's going to buy these things? And verification, as you pointed out, is not easy. I've been to a couple of Al Gore meetings, Climate Underground, and he's invested in some of these things that were going to only take a year or two. And after the 6th year, he said, I think I'm not going to get my investment back. I've been working on a different approach, and I interviewed farmers, and I've come up with 3 categories of BMPs, or 4 categories. One is what I call no regret BMPs, things that farmers are going to do regardless because they make money doing it, like zero till in Saskatchewan. You'd have to pay them maybe even $125 or $200 to stop because it pays. So we need to develop more no regret BMPs. Easier said than done, but there's some really potential technology that will fit in there. The next group would call neutral BMPs, like renewable diesel. Doesn't change what a farmer does on the fields, doesn't change food supply, may cost somebody a little bit more money. But the next one are sacrifice BMPs.
David, can we have a question?
Yeah, well, the question is, why are you making this so complicated? When I think there's more direct approaches that farmers will buy into, because I don't think a few dollars of carbon credit are going to influence any farmers.
That's an interesting way to end. As I mentioned, the goal of this was never to have carbon credits. The goal was to find a way to quantify the outcomes of that living land and what was happening, and on many different levels. And so we had to pick a box on the web, and you picked a different box than I did, but it's still the same web. And the process of mapping carbon was a place to start. And I think that there's an opportunity in how, as I mentioned, AFSC has been working with some of the data to look at how it impacts yield and how it impacts losses, and Stuart can tell you all about that. But it's been a way all I heard the last few days was we want outcomes-based things. Well, if you want to do outcomes-based things, you're going to have to collect a lot of data, and you're going to have to satisfy a lot of different dynamics. And so I did not make it this complicated. The world made it this complicated. I have just tried to find a path that might help inspire people to do better management, and actually, and truly at my core, it's just truly being able to validate the work that people are doing, and that experience of stepping onto land, feeling it alive, and knowing that that is good for the earth. And so all of these other mechanisms are just a step toward that.